All right, so my next story, I wanted to talk about the Travis Kalanick appearance on the All In podcast. And he comes on the show multiple times throughout the year. I think he's done appearances on the summit that they do. For those that don't know, Travis was the founder of Uber, and then he had some kind of tumultuous times at the company. And now he is focused on not technically the Uber side of things, but he has a company called Cloud Kitchens, which I think was a really clever way to capitalize on that IP of that language becoming popular. But then he also has a company called Lab Robotics. And so I really wanted to dig into just some findings that I took away from his appearance on this podcast, and then some lessons that we can potentially distill for either operators who are kind of dipping their toes into this idea of automated food systems and infrastructure in their business, or actually a really valuable takeaway that I found that doesn't impact restaurants as much as I thought when we think about food automation. And so for those that, I'll just give a very quick TLDW summary of the demo that he gave, which was they're thinking of basically having a conveyor belt robot installed in a warehouse, a cloud kitchen, so to speak. And when given prepped food items, it can basically do the whole assembly, get it in a bag with utensils into a locker so that a delivery driver can just go wave their phone in front of a locker and the door that the meal is housed in opens, and that delivery driver grabs that food item, puts it into their car, and then drives to the destination.
Okay.
And he gave some really interesting examples where he says the mission of lab robotics is infrastructure for better food. And he talked about the real importance of end-to-end automation when it comes to autonomous infrastructure inside of food businesses. And he gave this hilarious example, which was instead of one guy making pizzas, these robotics companies came in and they said, we have a robot that makes pizzas. And because it wasn't end-to-end and full stack with the entire process of order comes in, delivery needs to be fulfilled, what he says you landed on was instead of one guy making pizzas, you have two guys, because one guy needs to be on one side of the robot feeding in ingredients, and then the other guy needs to be on the other side of the robot getting the cooked pizzas and putting them into boxes and getting them to the delivery drivers. He said you have two guys and a $1 million machine in the middle of them making pizzas, which I think is so freaking true at the state of robotics in kitchens, and it's one of the reasons why it hasn't quite yet caught on yet. In addition to all the complexities that are required with dexterity and measuring and, all of these other things. So he has some interesting language that he used that I hadn't quite heard before in this vertical, so to speak. And so one is, we call it cooking. So you take a chicken breast and it goes from a raw marinated chicken breast to all of a sudden being, ready to serve. You might actually be more up on this than I am, Ray, but he called it state change,
Okay.
which is really interesting. So it's like there's a state change step of the process where we're taking something from, like raw to cooked. And I was like, that's an interesting way to kind of like vernacular change how we're talking about these things.
Yeah.
And then he also talks about a stage of the process being assembly, which I think most of us can kind of, intuit. But what's awesome about this system is it dispenses the bowls. It dispenses exactly to the gram, however many, grams of chickpeas need to be in this, bowl that you're making. He shared some really interesting industry stats. Still, even at this age of, we think DoorDash has saturated everything and delivery apps on your phone are offering this unprecedented convenience, he says, still, quote, 85% of all meals are still at home. And the majority of those 85% are still made at home, which I think is just, kind of, we can take off our horse blinders for a second and say, wow, people are still eating at home a lot. He also shares the stat that only 1.8% of meals are DoorDash, Uber Eats, those types of meals.
No.
Like in the scope of,
That's
humans
wild.
eat 3 meals a day, those types of things.
I thought it would have been.
I thought it would have been higher too. And that totally surprised me. And this is a quote from his interview. I haven't fact checked this just to
He's lying.
Put that caveat in it.
Okay.
He's lying. So here, interesting takeaways. One was owning the stack is going to be super, super, super important. So I think that puts me in a headspace of, okay, unless you see a competitor who is genuinely doing that, like from the order being brought in all the way through the assembly, custom fit things, actually being able to have the assembly lines and the prep lead into the assembly robot, so to speak. It's not that we don't need to be worried about them, but it might not be economically feasible with the way that certain things cost right now for them to actually usurp your business. from a competitor standpoint. Number two, he talked about this idea of we can take labor costs from, he says, in cloud kitchens right now, in the traditional sense of how they're running them, labor costs is anywhere from 30 to 35%. And he said, with this autonomous end-to-end process with automation, we can drive those costs down to 7 to 10%. And even that as a concept, whether it's true or not, again, we need to see how this plays out when it actually hits scale.
Yeah.
Actually, if people end up, supply and demand. But that is a gargantuan savings that I don't like. Tell me another way that people are going to be able to hit that. It's really hard to argue, the other side of how we're going to be able to cut costs down in that way. And now you might wonder, does that mean it's coming from my job? Which also I kept very top of mind as I was listening to this conversation. He had a real flip that changed my mind on this. And he said, if we have the ability to drive costs down that much, the current iteration of the machines that they have can churn out 300 bowls an hour, which is not nothing, but it's not a gargantuan amount of food. But at the same time, it's all you have to do is either have multiple of them, or you have to, decrease the cost on the actual production of the machine. And now it's, starting to become really, really compelling.
Yeah.
His idea was you don't have to be wealthy to eat healthy, which kind of flows on to some of the stories you've been talking about with GLP-1 stuff. And I know that we've had some pushback in the comments that I think you've covered, which is, why do I, as the chef at a restaurant, have to be accommodating in this capacity? And what this interview really drew to mind for me was maybe this takes a little bit of that onus off of restaurants in some way, shape, or form. Because, take aside the context where that person needs to come to dinner with a group or, one of those potential reasons. But as we think about the majority of the meals that person is eating, they might end up being covered by a full stack automated solution like this. And then the other really important point that he shared was, so the first one is you are going to be able to get tailor-made food with your dietary restrictions in mind. Maybe it's not even a restriction. Maybe it's I need this meal to have 50 grams of protein in it, and I'm going to be able to request that. And it's not going to cost $45 for me to get that delivered. It's going to be $17. We're going to be back in a state of what we were used to pre-pandemic from a pricing perspective because of how costs were able to be driven down, which leads into the fascinating implication of these infrastructure plays are not coming for restaurants, they're coming for grocery stores. Because if you think about it, if I can pay the same amount, the meme on Twitter, I think at least, is why would I buy all the ingredients for pad thai when I can just, I spent $40 to do the ingredients for pad thai, or I could do $27 to order pad thai from my favorite Thai place? That is actually the problem now, is that grocery stores are now the actual person who's going to be at risk here. Because with food costs going up from a just raw product perspective and the grocery stores need to make their margin, now we're really in a pickle, because why would I go and, it's a time-saving thing now, because now I can pay the exact as it would be to get the raw ingredients, and I don't have to spend the time to actually cook it myself. Oh my goodness, now this is a huge unlock. And what are some of the other implications that come from this with, I know Blue Apron kind of had a boom and a bust with getting prepped ingredients, so to speak, delivered to your place. But, he talks about this idea of people love cooking at home. Is there a world where we could, get an 80% ready to eat meal delivered to somebody's house, and they actually do the final things at home because we were able to get so many of the steps of the process? Maybe the meat is already braised and we have the pasta ready to go, and all you need to do is just kind of heat up the sauce and the braised meat and the, pasta together. And now it's you have a pretty compelling meal at home for a fraction of the cost of what you're used to from some of these delivery companies. And so we'll link the full interview. It's it's in the first 15 minutes of the podcast. They talk about a bunch of other stuff in startup and tech land in the rest of it. But I thought it was just a really interesting, my ears perked up when I was listening to this, because I, one, didn't think it was going to come for grocery stores. I hadn't quite done that math in my head. And two, this idea of what happens in a world where we can drastically reduce the cost of meals, not just from a financial perspective, but how much time humans are spending cooking on what he talks about is that 85%. This is not replacing restaurants. We still will want to go out to eat in those places where we're going to experience hospitality. But man, I was just struck by some of the implications of this.
Yeah, it reminds me of actually in Naperville here, Sweet Green's Infinity Kitchen. I don't know if
we have one of those in Seattle too.
Yeah,
I haven't been to one
Mhm.
yet. I don't know if you have been.
Yeah, I've been there. I mean, and I think back to your labor thing. I mean, they still have 5, 7 employees back there making sure everything runs. It's just like the friction of the longer tasks. I think that it does is like helping with that, and I'm sure it saves on labor. Um, but yeah, it just reminds me of that. And yeah, I agree with you. Like 300 portions doesn't sound like a large amount, but if that's like, I mean, that's a lot of customers. That's more than a restaurant cover in a single night. Like that's is a sizable amount. I would say that like with food automation, like there is a lot of progress, but I do think we overstate where it's at. I do think that you still need a ton of manual labor in the food industry. I don't actually don't see it as one of the more AI ridden or automation driven spaces. You'd be surprised at how many large companies still rely on labor because food is so finicky and tricky to get right. So yeah, I think anything that takes us a step towards that automation is interesting, but at the same time, it's also interesting to see how like you still will need labor in a sense. And regarding diner expectations, yeah, I mean, with costs of things going up, I do think the preparedness of a meal is what people want, whether or not it's cooked or they just simply have to cook different things for themselves. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see where it goes. And obviously, he's someone who's shaken up an industry before. So if his sights are set on like food automation, then obviously it's something to be watching out for.
Well, and he talks about the idea of the infrastructure needing to be built because he said with Uber, it was so clear to see that the roads as an infrastructure piece were already built for cars to drive on. And a large swath of people had cars that weren't used 95% of the day. And so Uber had a really easy, straightforward go to market, quote unquote, strategy. And of course, it was difficult to implement, but like it wasn't actually like the pipes, quote unquote, were missing to get this up and off the ground. Whereas with this endeavor, it certainly is. And I think what's nice about it is they've run the numbers to show that this makes sense. And they're thinking about it in a way that is not what you're talking about with the Sweetgreen Infinite Kitchen, where you look around and you're like, okay, this is, like we've gone from 6 people to 5 people. It's like, it's just not enough. Like we need to save more in order for this massive infrastructure and CapEx to actually pay off for us.
Yeah.